It's been a century since the start of the First World War, so how should Canadians view our country's military contributions to the Great War? Our guest tonight is here to shed some light on that. Tim Cook is an historian at the Canadian War Museum. He is also the author of a forthcoming book on World War II. It is called The Necessary War. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
We'll talk about World War II another time. We're talking about World War I tonight with you.
Good.
Okay, 1914, how would you characterize Canada's, the state of Canada's military at the start of the war?
Well, we had almost no military. Canada was a nation of about 8 million, largely rural, deeply connected to the British Empire, but we had almost always relied on Britain for our defense. We only had about 3,000 professional soldiers. So when Canada found itself at war on the 4th of August, 1914, and I use that word, found itself at war, we didn't decide to go to war. We were deeply unprepared. And so there was a real period of frenzy, both the excitement of this war, which seems a bit odd today, almost 100 years later, but there had been a growing anticipation of this. And when they opened the doors of the armories on the 5th of August, the lineups just stretched around the block, and this was in every major city across the country.
You say every major city, big lineup. So the makeup of the average soldier, there isn't one sort of prototype of the Canadian soldier.
There isn't. At the start of the war, they were largely British-born. So about 60% of those Canadians who went overseas in what was called the first contingent, about 30,000, were British-born. But most of the officers were Canadian. And that would change during the course of the war. The average age was about 26, so it's a little older than we think about. Many people who walk the cemeteries today, they see 15-year-olds and 17-year-olds and 18-year-olds, but there's also 40-year-olds and 45-year-olds and 50-year-olds, so around 26. And this was an army of civilian soldiers. That's important to keep in mind. Since we didn't have a professional force, these were farmers, they were clerks, they were students, and of course they were uncles and brothers and sons. And that made it a very different fighting force. Of course, this was a national army, and we would eventually put over 600,000 Canadians in uniform.
All right, so the regular guys, really, they go to Europe, they arrive on the front. What's the Western Front like when they get there?
Well, we were lucky to miss the killing battles of 1914. These were the titanic affairs of Germany smashing through Belgium, attacking France, and then, of course, the enormous firepower. Modern weapons, rifles, machine guns, rapid-firing artillery. It decimated the armies. There were hundreds of thousands of dead in the first months of the war. And the only way to escape that was to go below ground. At first, they dug ditches to escape. Then the ditches became a trench. Then the trench became a trench system. Eventually, it ran 700 kilometers from Switzerland to the North Sea. So that's what the Canadians went into. This underground city, this fortress, running through much of northern France and Belgium, which the Germans were occupying. And that's where the Canadians arrived in February of 1915. Of course, it was not a good time to arrive. The snow, the sleet, there were unburied corpses in the trenches. The letters from the soldiers, which are so powerful and poignant, they talk about literally arms jutting out of the wall, rotting corpses, the rats that fed upon the flesh. Pretty soon, everyone was infested with lice. And this is where they went. And within about 6 weeks of just no big battles, just 6 weeks there, they lost 278 men, killed and wounded to snipers and artillery fire. And these sort of casualties would just get worse as the big battles unfolded.
You know, when we think of this war, or any other for that matter, you know, we all have an image that we ascribe to the war. And usually it's fighting or bodies or something like that. Soldiers spend a lot of time not fighting. So during World War I, the Canadians, aside from fighting Germans, how are they spending their time?
Well, this is a war where the shovel is as important as the rifle, because they're always digging. They're always building new trenches because of enemy shell fire, which is caving in these trench walls. And of course, trenches are about 5 feet deep and 2 or 3 feet of sandbags on top. And sandbags are just sort of jute bags filled with soil. And they literally had to dig up much of northern France in this area. And the soldiers would make jokes about this because they hated it, right? They wanted...
Who likes digging?
They didn't sign up to dig. And that, of course, is the job of most soldiers. They're stuck in this stalemate. No one can attack or push forward because of enemy barbed wire and machine guns, and every time they try that, they get torn apart. But what's different about this is that every single day, men are being killed, and they're being killed in ghastly ways. Their heads are being blown off. They're being shredded by artillery shells that are exploding above them. Later on in the war, the unleashing of chemical weapons. In so great quantities, by 1917, 1918, gas is being used on every battlefield. And so it's a very strange environment. They are trying to both learn how to survive and then find ways to fight their way through the enemy system.
Okay, let's just go back from to the early years when Canada arrives in Europe. How are they doing on the battlefield? Because as you said earlier, I mean, these are just regular folks, really. They're, this was not supposed to be their life. They go over to Europe to fight this war. Yeah. How are they doing on the battlefield in the early part of the war?
The early part of the war, the first major battles at the Second Battle of Ypres in April of 1915. The first battle had been fought about 5 months earlier in the northern part of Belgium, around the city of Ypres. And it was a salient, so it jutted out into the enemy lines, and that's where the Germans were attacking. So the Canadians went right into that, largely, as you said, untried, untested. A lot of their soldiers had militia experience, or they were ex-British soldiers. So they weren't, it wasn't like me walking into uniform, and they'd had several months to train, but of course combat is so different than anything that can happen in training. And then on the 22nd of April, 1915, that's when the Germans unleashed chlorine gas for the first time in the history of warfare. And there were no gas masks. And this gas cloud, about 5 kilometers deep and thick, rolls through 2 French divisions on the left of the Canadians. Some of the Canadians are gassed, and the 2 French divisions flee. And the British High Command sees a disaster here. I mean, This is it. This is the breakthrough. The Germans are going to do this. The Canadians shift over and they attack and they counterattack. And they do very well, but they lose thousands of men. So over about a 4-day period, the Canadian division loses 6,000 killed, wounded, and captured, the Second Battle of Ypres. Now, it's the battle that really makes the reputation of the Canadians. If they had broken in the face of this chemical pestilence, I think we could understand that, but we'd have a very different reputation. And the Canadians are seen as this northern, strong voyageurs. The propaganda of the time is fabulous. The Canadians are born in igloos, and they all have a rifle in their hand, and they hunt bears. And of course, most of them come from inner cities, right? Toronto and Montreal and Ottawa and Halifax, Vancouver. So Second Ypres makes the reputation of the Canadians. But then we'll fight a series of battles after that, at Festubert, at Saint-Eloi, at Montsorel in June of 1916. And the Canadians are less successful here. They're often on the brunt of German offensives. Our soldiers are fighting very hard, but they're losing horrendous casualties. 2,500 at Festubert, 1,300 at Saint-Eloi, 10,000 at Montsorel. I mean, think of these figures. Imagine a Canada dealing with this. It thinks this is a sort of naive war, that it's going to be over by Christmas. Okay, it's going to stretch beyond that. And all of a sudden, thousands of names begin to come back.
And to just make the point that these are whopping numbers no matter what the population is. But we're talking about a very small country at the time, 8 million people, right?
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to talk more about the bigger battles as we kind of move along in our conversation. But I want to ask you, there's this story that emerges at some point during the war of a Canadian being crucified.
Right.
Is that true?
It's not true. Okay. It happened at the Second Battle of Ypres, so that first battle in April of 1915. This was a constricting battle, so the Canadians were fighting this, the Germans being pushed back. During the battle, there are rumors among the soldiers that one of their soldiers has been crucified on a barn door, and that the Germans were laughing at the soldier as he died there. And it enrages Canadians. Of course, it enrages the soldiers, it enrages those people on the home front, and it galvanizes the war effort. There were all kinds of investigations to find out who this crucified soldier was, and they interviewed war heroes and Canadians who were later winning gallantry awards, and none of the stories line up. And it just doesn't make a lot of sense. But it was later codified in this bronze sculpture called Canada's Golgotha. And that's on display at my museum, the Canadian War Museum, right now.
With a disclaimer saying this didn't happen?
Well, that's right, to say that this was something that motivated Canadians in the war. And it motivated some Canadian soldiers not to take prisoners. So it was really quite a significant event. And the Canadians acquired a reputation during the war, as did other Dominion troops like the Australians and New Zealanders, for not taking prisoners. Now, the caveat there, I should note, is that we took about 43,000 prisoners during the war. So that's clearly not true. But again, this question of reputations is an interesting one. And the one of the Canadians during the war is that of these northern tough warriors who are thrown onto the battlefield to deliver victory.
Okay, reputation counts for a lot during a conflict. So do tactics. So talk to me about how the Canadian Corps' tactics sort of evolved during the war.
Sure. At the start of the war, it's largely riflemen with bayonets and rudimentary machine guns. As the war progresses, though, each time they try to attack the enemy trenches and they fail with horrendous casualties, they begin to think, how do we process this? The lessons learned. So they bring in more artillery guns and more shells. They begin to lay down bombardments of tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands of high explosive shells. They introduce poison gas to try to literally poison the enemy to death. Better machine guns, new tactics on how to fight. All of this is coming together. The introduction of the tank in September of 1916, air power. The First World War sees a massive evolution and a revolution in military tactics and doctrine. And I say that that's important to point out, I think, because I think the popular memory of the war is the first day of the Somme. The 1st of July, 1916, 120,000 British soldiers and about 1,000 Newfoundlanders get out of their trenches and walk forward into the enemy lines, and 57,000 are killed or wounded. It's a ghastly slaughter. But that isn't the war. The war is, in fact, one of learning and processing. The only problem is that the Germans are doing the same thing.
Right.
Their defensive doctrine is evolving. They're finding ways to cope and endure as well. And that leads to the prolongation of this war and the attritional nature of it. There's no easy victory. There's no way to break through. And I think that's important to keep in mind.
Maybe I should know this, and maybe more Canadians know this than I think do, but who's leading our troops? Who's commanding our troops?
Well, it's a good question, and it's the British soldiers for the most part. At the highest level, we fight as part of the British Expeditionary Force. Various commanders, but Sir Douglas Haig by 1916 to the end of the war. But there are Canadian officers at the junior level, and as we gain more experience, we begin to rise up. And we talked about the 1st Division, but a 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Division will go overseas, and they'll all be fighting by 1916, and they're about 100,000 strong in what's known as the Canadian Corps. And by the last year and a half, it will be commanded by Sir Arthur Currie, a Canadian-born militiaman who's widely regarded as one of the finest generals of the war. Now, the irony there is he was not loved by his Canadians. He was not a charismatic man. He was kind of pear-shaped, but he had a good mind for war, and he tried to ration the soldiers' lives. But it's worth remembering that Canadian Corps, 100,000 strong, and then just think, in 1914, we had only 3,000 professional soldiers. So there's an incredible change in Canada as we become a nation that is really a nation geared for war.
We're several minutes into our conversation. I don't know exactly how many, but several minutes. I don't think you've mentioned the words Vimy Ridge, which is interesting. And we can't talk about Canada in the First World War without talking about it. So, 7-kilometer long ridge in northern France. We'll put up a map so our viewers can see exactly where in France it is. What's the strategic importance of this battle? We talk about Vimy, but from a strategy point, Tim, what's the importance of this battle?
Well, we attack Vimy Ridge in April of 1970 as part of a larger British and French offensive. Now, it's interesting, if you talk to British historians, French historians, American historians, they've never heard of Vimy Ridge. That's our battle. And I don't think we should have any shame in that. I don't think we should say it's not important just because the Americans don't know about it.
It's our battle.
It's our battle. And it was the place where all 4 divisions, the Canadian Corps, attacked together for the first time. So 100,000 soldiers from across the country, every province, every city, every major town, Canadians were there. And there was an enormous preparation for this battle. The Canadians had about 2 months. Their commander at the time was Sir Julian Byng, who was a British general, later Governor General of Canada, much loved by the Canadians. And he prepared the Canadians for this incredible battle against what was really a fortress. The British and the French had tried to attack it at least half a dozen times. They'd lost 300,000 soldiers, killed and wounded. So this is a nearly impregnable fortress. The Canadians are given it, and they attack and they capture it over a 4-day period, and it's an absolute bloodbath.
You say it's our battle. It's our battle, because part of our history, it was, as you mentioned, the British and French couldn't take it. Maybe that's why they don't talk about it. But what was it about them? Why couldn't they take it?
Earlier in the war, they had tried to attack it. They didn't have enough artillery. They hadn't prepared enough. The Canadians have gone through a major evolution between the Battle of the Somme in late 1916 and early 17. And they changed the way that they do artillery fire plans. They introduced something called the creeping barrage, which is a wall of shell fire that will fall in front of the Canadians, chew up the German lines, and we will advance behind that. And all of this gives the Canadian infantrymen a fighting chance. But the key word there is fighting. It is a tremendous, brutal combat, and we lose 10,602 killed and wounded in 4 days. So Vimy is a significant accomplishment, but we pay for it in blood. And then I think what's important about Vimy is that after the war, we choose Vimy to be a kind of signal event for the First World War. It represents more than a 4-day battle. And when we put the memorial there, unveiled in 1936, Walter Allward's really majestic memorial that still stands to this day, that Canadians still make a pilgrimage to, we said as Canadians that this would be an important event for us. So I think that Vimy is more than a battle. It seems to represent the entire war, the sacrifice, and of course the changes that come out of the First World War.
Sure, and we were talking before we started taping about choosing narratives and symbolic images to represent any and all conflicts. Okay, let's talk about another one, Passchendaele, which I think Canadians are less familiar with than Vimy. It's in Belgium. How significant a victory is Passchendaele for the Canadians?
Well, the Canadians come off the victory at Vimy in April of 1917, and then they'll fight in a series of battles in the summer of 1917, and then at a crucial battle at the place called Hill 70.
We'll talk about Hill 70 in a minute.
Right, so that's August of 1917, and it's a really innovative plan, and we capture, or at least we inflict a terrible loss on the Germans. But at this point, the Canadians have lost 40,000 men. Killed and wounded in 17. So we're wearing down. Wow. In the north, Sir Douglas Haig, the British commander, has launched what he called his Flanders offensive on the 31st of July, and it bogged down almost immediately. It begins to rain. The shell fire, these million shell bombardments, tear up the battlefield. And while they inflict losses on the Germans, you can't then pass over that. So it's sort of reduced to a bog of corpses and mud and craters, and some of those powerful images of what we think of the war in this desolate landscape, they come from Passchendaele. And I think Paul Gross's film of 2008, Passchendaele, captured that very nicely. So the Canadians get called north to really launch a series of attacks there. Sir Arthur Currie, the commander, doesn't want to go. He doesn't think it's worthwhile, but Haig pressures him, and he eventually agrees, but only if the British will give us more guns and time to prepare the battlefield. And we attack there in 4 set-piece battles on the 26th and the 30th of October, and the 6th and the 10th of November. And we capture Passchendaele Ridge. So it's a symbolic victory. It didn't change the war. The Germans had been holding very tough there, but it's a part of this attritional warfare where the two sides are grinding each other up. And that will lead to 1918, where the Germans have knocked Russia out of the war, and Russia, of course, torn by its civil war, and they will turn their forces back to the Western Front and try to knock the Allies out, and they failed to do that.
You mentioned Hill 70, so let's talk about that because, you know, there's Vimy, there's Somme, there's Ypres, there's Passchendaele, and then there's Hill 70, because I don't think very many Canadians know about Hill 70. Okay, what was this one about?
I suspect most people have never heard of Hill 70. But it's a battle in August of 1917. Again, so it comes in the Vimy sector. If you stand on Vimy Ridge, you can see Lens. It's a coal mining town. It's about 15 kilometers or so away. And the Germans were holding that. This was part of their occupation of northeastern France, where they're extracting coal and stuff to propel their war effort. Sir Arthur Currie, the new corps commander, is told by his army commander to do a frontal assault on Lens. Now, the Germans have been dug in there for 2 years. This is not a good plan. Currie looks at this, he studies the battlefield, and he sees a hill to the north of Lens, Hill 70. And he says, it would be wiser if we attack that, hold it, and then force the Germans to counterattack us, to come out of their trenches. Now, the British general, Sir Henry Horne, was a sensible man. He said, that's a much better plan. And so the Canadians attacked on the 15th of August, and it went according to plan. Currie's forces grabbed this hill, occupy it. They rushed forward 160 machine gun crews, hundreds of artillery guns backing it. And the Germans, because this was the nature of the German war at the time and tactics, they counterattacked. So they got out of their trenches and rushed forward, and they rushed into the face of these machine guns. They were torn apart, and it was a horrendous slaughter. But it did tie down the Germans, it attrited their forces, and it really saved, in the strategic sense, it forced them to send reserves to that front as opposed to Sir Douglas Haig's Flanders front. So that's the interconnectedness of this war. And Hill 70, while not known, I think, to most Canadians, about 10,000 Canadians were killed or wounded there, and it's a significant battle for the Canadian Corps.
I want to just tally up these numbers with you because, 10,000 at Hill 70, 30,000 elsewhere. I want to go through some of these numbers with you, Tim. Okay, so we have 620,000 Canadians enlisted with the Canadian Expeditionary Force.
Right.
So of that, 61,000 are killed. That's nearly 10%, right? Okay.
And in fact, even more, because only about 450,000 ever make it to England.
Right.
So in fact, if you were a frontline infantryman, you had about an 8 in 10 chance of being killed or wounded in this war. Wow. Just horrific figures.
You mentioned wounded, 172,000 Canadian soldiers wounded, and 9,000 others identified as suffering from shell shock.
Right.
I should mention Newfoundland suffered, about 1,300 killed and several thousand wounded. Tiny little place, right?
Yeah.
All these dead and wounded from, we're spending the summer talking about World War I. We have all these dead Canadians from a population of 8 million. How do you account for such high casualty figures? By any standards, despite what the population is, that number, 10%, a little bit more. How do you account for that?
Well, those are horrendous figures, aren't they? I mean, if we were to think today, as I think you mentioned earlier, a country we're about 4 times as large, today's equivalent, 250,000 dead over a 4-year period. I mean, how would our country deal with that massive grief? And this is what the generation had to deal with. Every city, every town, every village losing its sons, its brothers, its uncles. And of course, they memorialize it in many ways on those memorials that are still there today. You go to a small town, you see the names of 40 young men there, and you think there was probably only 200 or 300 people living in this town.
I was shocked. I went to my kid's school and, read the plaque at the front. And I mean, it just goes on
the schools,
and on and on.
Any school over 100 years old in this country has the list of the fallen, in churches as well. So this is a tragedy for Canada, as it is a tragedy worldwide, more than 9 million dead. The question you asked is, how did we get there? Well, Cook, you're talking about this evolution in tactics and artillery and machine guns, and yes, and there is an enormous change that goes on. They learn to fight more effectively. But as I said earlier, the Germans are as well. And so there's no easy way to fight on the Western Front. If you have to do a frontal assault against 30 machine guns firing 500 bullets a minute, you will lose men, no matter what you do. And the Canadians were very good at preparing the battlefield, at supporting their soldiers with massive artillery fire, with giving them the tools to fight their way forward. But even when we are winning, we are always losing. And that's never so apparent than in the last 100 Days campaign. This is a campaign I suspect most Canadians have not heard of either. It's when the Canadian Corps is punching above its weight, its hardest. This is when we are the shock troops. But the problem being shock troops is that you're thrown into the most difficult positions.
Sure.
And battles from Amiens on the 8th of August, 1918, the crashing of the Arras line, the Hindenburg line, Cambrai. It's a series of battles, one after another, where Canadians and at Amiens, Australians are a spearhead force, and we are driving the Germans back. But that's a period also of 45,000 casualties. So again, it's this idea that in this really terrible, grinding, attritional war, this is industrialized warfare, and there's no easy way to win.
And, maybe this connection is connected to what you've just said. But to what extent do we romanticize, Canada's military contribution to World War I? Things like Vimy Ridge.
Right. I think you're right. There is a desire.
I mean, I suggest that it's coping, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think you have to separate what's happening at the time and what happens after. So at the time, of course, there is propaganda in Canada. There's censorship. Some historians have suggested that people on the home front didn't know what was happening. That's nonsense. You open up any newspaper, the lists of casualties are there. Everyone you know on your street or block or at church has lost somebody. So Canadians knew what was happening. I don't think they understood the full extremity of fighting on the Western Front. What was it like to be a trench soldier? That's a unique experience. And the soldiers who survive and come back after the war will write about that. And that's that war literature book, All Quiet on the Western Front, or Generals Die in Bed, a Canadian novel, that will shock Canadians. And it takes time to process this war. And there is a desire to memorialize the fallen. 61,000 dead, as you said. Another 5,000 dead who die in the 2 or 3 years after the war from their injuries or the Spanish flu. And so this is a war that forever shapes Canada. It is a nation-building event. We come together like never before. It also nearly tears us apart. The conscription crisis of 1917 sets community against community. And so it's a war that I think 100 years later, we should not celebrate. Celebrate is the wrong word. It is a war, though, that we have to commemorate, that we have to mark. It is a turning point in our history. And I think individual Canadians will have different views and opinions on how to do this. At the community level, there will be a different desire than at the national level and at the international level. But Canadians, I think, many Canadians, and I think around the world, there is a desire to mark this war that really forever changed the 20th century.
I appreciate you for coming in and helping us mark this war and remembering it and commemorating it. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.